I think I think we're ready to go. So I am delighted to join you. Uh, I am in Syracuse, New York, Dr. Sally Roesch Wagner, and I am in Onondaga Territory. This is the center of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. It's a beautiful day here, and I'm amazed if anybody is not uh, in the great outdoors today. We're having unseasonably warm and frighteningly, I think, warm weather. If this is an indication of what climate catastrophe is bringing us. Um, and yes, climate catastrophe does relate to the talk today, I think. What I want to share with you today is how Native people, specifically the Haudenosaunee, influenced the women's rights movement. Now, that sounds like, where did this come from? This doesn't make any sense. We keep our histories separate. So we have women's history over here, we have Native American history over here, we have people of color generally, African Americans. It's all separate. But I think in this historic moment, what we're doing is beginning to bring together all of these stories. And I want to bring two of them together for you today. It's 2000, um, it's the 100th anniversary, 2020, is the 100th anniversary of women gaining suffrage in the United States in the Constitution. That didn't mean we had it in practice. It just means that the Constitution in the 19th Amendment, which was finally ratified by enough states in 1920, it meant that the states could no longer deprive women of the right to vote, which they had from the time of the Revolution. Now, by the time the 19th Amendment was passed, there were all but 8 states that in which the constitutions had been changed. But if we take ourselves back to before the women's rights movement, what caused it, and what was the position of women in the United States, in each of the states at that point? Well, if we take a broad overlook, with the revolution, women's position actually decreased in status because before the revolution, in the colonial period, women voted if they had sufficient property. Property rights were the defining quality. If you had enough property, you were allowed to vote, whether you were a man or a woman. But with the revolution and the state constitutions, what each of them did was to place in that it was the only voters were male, white. Some of them still had property qualifications, but essentially it made it illegal for women or African American men to vote. So women also practiced in the colonies as attorneys. There were no qualifications. So if you apprenticed and you became a physician or an attorney, or you practiced medicine or law, it wasn't until after the revolution that it became necessary to get a degree, and women and African American men were excluded from the universities, the medical schools, the law schools, were not allowed to practice. So the position of women becomes worse after the revolution. And it really becomes very bad because the states adopt the Blackstone Code. This is a common law code that has just been codified in England. And instead of discarding this part of British rule, the founding fathers chose to adopt this. And what did it mean? Basically, the two become one in marriage, and the one is the man. Women cease to exist legally once they marry. You just, you're not there anymore. You're basically the property of your husband, but you have no legal existence, meaning that you can't sue or be sued. You can't serve on a jury. You can't write a will. Every single thing that you own becomes your husband's. That includes your body. Husbands had the right to force their wives to live where they lived. A runaway wife could be apprehended by the law and brought back to her rightful owner. Husbands had the right to beat their wives as long as they did not inflict permanent damage. They had the right to force obedience. They had the right to rape their wives. It wasn't until the second wave of feminism in the 70s and 80s that those laws began to be changed so that rape no longer was defined legally as it was previously as an act of unlawful sexual intercourse with someone other than the wife of the perpetrator. In other words, marriage was the defense for rape. Um, so, what else? Well, you had no right to your body in any way. You also had no right to the children that you bore. A husband in the state of New York, and this was true in many of the states, could will away an unborn child. In his will, is let's say he knows he's dying, his wife is pregnant. He says, upon his death and the birth of this child, the child will be taken from the mother and given to this person as the rightful guardian, the rightful owner. And that child would be ripped out of their mother's arms and given to its owner. And the mother had no legal recourse. Of course, you couldn't vote. You're a non-entity. Um, Property, body rights, no legal existence. That was the position of married women. I think Elizabeth Cady Stanton at one point said that a woman needs to have a quit claim deed to her own body. And she refused in the marriage ceremony to accept the words obey. The marriage ceremony at that time required that the woman say that she will obey her husband. And that, of course, was not part of what was required of him because he was the one. And when the two became one. So, this was the position of the women in upstate New York when they began to think there might be a possibility of something else. And what's one of the ways in which that new possibility was revealed to them? Well, if we think about the settler women came in to a functioning community. It had been destabilized by the Sullivan Clinton scorched earth campaign of George Washington during the Civil War, I mean, the Revolutionary War, in which Washington's orders to the soldiers were to destroy every living thing in Haudenosaunee territory. The government didn't really have enough money to pay the soldiers. So the idea was we'll pay them in the land after we take them, and that's what happened. So much of this upstate is military tract land that was given to the soldiers in payment for their Revolutionary War services. So despite that destabilization, when the settlers began to move in, they were living among people who had a highly developed civilization and political system and social system. What did it look like? Well, I shouldn't say what did it look like in the past, because the Haudenosaunee have maintained this traditional system. Just to refresh you, if we are talking about the Haudenosaunee, we're talking about what the French called the Iroquois. That was their word, their made-up word, like Indian. This settler idea that we can name these people that are here without, of course, recognizing that they have their own names for themselves. The Haudenosaunee were known by the English as the Five Nations, or um, so we have from the eastern door, the Mohawks are the keepers of the eastern door, and then we go to the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, the Seneca, and then Tuscarora came up later and joined the Confederacy when they were being massacred in North Carolina. This Confederacy continues in the same manner that it was founded 1,000 years ago on the shores of Onondaga Lake, 20 minutes away from where I am right now. Um, the founders of the Confederacy came together on the basis of peace. They had been warring. The peacemaker came and got all of the nations to agree to cease war. And they took the tallest tree, I guess. I'm a non native, I'm telling you this story as an outsider. But the stories I've heard it been told and read it, they took the tallest tree and they upended it, and they threw all of their weapons of war into the hole that it left. And of course, the aquifer carried all those weapons of war away. And then they replaced the tree. It's the great tree of peace. And the roots go out, the white roots of peace, so that any nation that wants to join in peace can follow those white roots and become part of the Confederacy, which is what the Tuscarora did. So, what is the position of women in the Confederacy? Well, because a woman, Jugunsase, was the first one to accept the message of peace when the peacemaker came through. The women hold the government in their hands. And how does that play out? Well, each chief is the voice of that clan. The basis of government isn't geographical location as it is in the United States. It's actually the extended family, the clan family. And the woman who is by known respect, often the oldest, it follows through the line. She is the clan mother, and she holds the symbol of authority of the government. And that is, it's basically, horns, and she holds on to that. And she places that on the chief. And in the condolence ceremony, puts him up in that position. Now, before she does that, think about the logic of this. So you're living in the longhouse, the clan family is, and it's going to be the mother, the father, maybe generations before that, and the sisters, their children, their husbands, and the unmarried brothers. When the brothers marry, they go to live in their wife's clan family because lineage is through the female. So these children know all of the sisters, their aunties, essentially as their mothers in a way. And if anything happens to the biological mother, the children stay with their clan family. And so here is the older woman, the clan mother, and she's watching these boys grow up. And she's watching for the little boy who is going to really sit back and watch what's going on and pay careful attention to what people need. Let's say that there's an elder there that he sees having some trouble walking. So he'll go over and help that elder. No fanfare, this is just what you do. And listens very carefully, doesn't put himself forward, but watches out for what are people saying? What are they needing? What are their interests and their concerns? That's the boy that the clan mother will look to be the future chief. So when the chief passes away, the horns return to the clan mother, the symbol of the position of that chief, the spokesperson for the clan, the voice for the clan. And the clan mother goes to everyone, women, children, especially the women, and says, do any of you know a reason why this man should not be put in the position? And if anyone has any reason, she will not accept. By that time, she's really pretty much, I would guess, vetted and knows that nomination is gonna go through. But everyone has a voice. It's not a representative democracy, it's a pure democracy with everybody having their own voice. It's the oldest, arguably, continuing democracy in the world today. So the clan mother then has gone through steps. And one of the things that I've been told, and this has been written, so it's okay for me to talk about it, is that she must follow three rules in thinking about him. He can't be a warrior. He can't be involved in military. He has to step down because it is a peace confederacy. He cannot have stolen anything. He cannot have, been a thief. And finally, he cannot have abused a woman. That is a qualification for being a chief. So if he passes all those tests and everyone agrees, she takes the horns and she places them on his head. And he is now the voice of the people. She is the eyes and the ears. So in order to know what he must say and do, he of course has to listen to her, to be responsible to the entire clan family, their needs, the confederacy, and the future generations. Every decision has to be made with 7 generations in mind. What will this effect be on the faces still in the ground, as they call the unborn? So he, let's say he doesn't listen to the clan mother, or he goes off on his own and makes a decision that benefits him. Um, she gives him a warning. She tries to bring him back to the path. And if he comes back, he continues on. Let's say he strays again. She gives him a second warning and works with him to bring him back. A third time, if he strays, goes off the path, makes a decision that doesn't benefit the people, she has the responsibility to remove him. Elizabeth Cady Stanton called it cutting off his horns. She describes that in an 1891 talk to the National Council of Women. Elizabeth Cady Stanton further in this talk talks about the position of women in a number of indigenous nations, far superior to her own. In another example, she talks about divorce, Haudenosaunee style. She says if he misbehaves himself, he'll just find his belongings outside the longhouse. That's it, in a minute. This looks really amazing to her because she has been called on the carpet. She has been called a heretic because she has advocated for women to be able to get out of marriages that are loveless and dangerous. If a woman is being beaten and she knows that her life may end, and as we know today, that still happens, she should have the right to divorce him. Well, generally, during this time, before the women's rights movement, early 1800s, denominations believed pretty universally that marriage was not a civil arrangement between two human beings, that it was in fact a covenant with God, and you couldn't break a covenant with God. Therefore, you couldn't get a divorce, and divorce was scarce in any laws in the country, and in the cases where it existed, it was very, very difficult, if not impossible, for a woman to get a divorce and to be able to leave. And also, if she left, the police would bring her back because she was a runaway wife. So for Elizabeth Cady Stanton, that method of women being able to protect themselves and get out of unhappy alliances looked very good to her. So did the birthing processes, which she was very concerned about. Women were in the United States in the settler colonial life. Women were for a month kept at home, and they gave birth with great difficulty. Elizabeth Cady Stanton said that's a result of the Bible, the story of Eve, that because of the sin of Eve eating the apple and getting Adam to, the punishment um, in the Bible is that she will give birth in pain and sorrow and be under the authority of her husband. And Stanton, and also Matilda Jocelyn Gage, who was the other major theoretician of the movement, both said that the common law, that women are dead in the law, the two become one and the one is the man, that woman is to be obedient to her husband and under his authority. They trace that back to the Bible, all the way from Genesis and the story of Eve to the end of the Old Testament, that women are to be under the authority of men throughout the Old and New Testament. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton looks at these indigenous nations and she is really impressed. Her nearest neighbor in Seneca Falls is a man who had previously had a trading post at the Onondaga Nation. He spoke the language fluently. His Onondaga, he'd been given an honorary adoption. His Onondaga relatives came to visit with him when he when they would travel through on the train. And so that was her nearest neighbor in Seneca Falls. She had a cousin named for an Oneida chief, a friend of their family, Skenendore, Peter Skenendore. And so we've looked at Stanton. Now, what about other women being influenced? Well, let's look at Seneca Falls, the Seneca Falls Convention, 1848. Planners of it, really, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are the two that we look at, although there were other Quaker women who were part of that planning. And what happened was that Lucretia Mott had been in this area. She'd been in New York State, but she had spent about a month at Cattaraugus, or she'd spent several weeks up there at least. It is a Seneca community, and she had watched the women with their political voice. She had watched them with their spiritual voice. She watched them plan the strawberry ceremony. This is at a time when Quakers could speak out in meeting, men and women, because there was more equality. But the hierarchical Christian religions, all the denominations, women could not speak from the pulpit. And that again goes back to the Bible and St. Paul. And so she's watching this, Christian heresy going on essentially, where the women are taking the responsibility, which is one of the responsibilities of the women to plan the spiritual ceremonies that go on throughout the year. She sees that. She sees women who have their own property, who have their own voice, who men listen to in a way she's never seen before. And she comes to, well, Waterloo to visit her Quaker friends. And then Elizabeth Cady Stanton comes to visit, and they plan the Seneca Falls Convention. Now, what did they talk about? Stanton talks about her discontent, and but we don't know what Lucretia Mott talked about. But if you've been to Paradise, you probably are going to mention it when you're sitting down with friends. The next thing you see, how do we know what importance she placed on it? Well, um, I did a women's suffrage movement anthology. My friend Gloria Steinem did the intro to it, and it, of course, begins with the Haudenosaunee influence, not once white women got here, which is the way we usually tell the story. That white exceptionalism party didn't start until we got here. Well, there was a very good party going on before. But one of the things that I found for this anthology was Lucretia Mott's description of that summer of 1848. She describes, it's actually a letter that she sent to the Liberator. It's the only thing I found describing her summer. And she writes it to the anti slavery paper, The Liberator. It's her whole, this is my summer. 3 paragraphs, she describes her experience with the Seneca at Cattaraugus. There's 1 paragraph on the Seneca Falls Convention. Now, I don't know whether that's the relative importance she placed on these two events, but that is what she wrote. That's the document. So Lucretia Mott is influenced, and she talks about, how can we say that our spiritual worship is any better than theirs? And she really has that openness to looking at the value and the importance. Let me give 2 other examples of the influence. One is, I'll take you to, and there's many more, I'm just giving you a highlight. A couple of my books, The Sisters in Spirit, The Haudenosaunee Influence on Women's Rights, tracks this down in detail with footnotes. And then I just did a form of it for young people. We Want Equal Rights. This just came out this fall, and it's more of you know a book for high school and probably somewhat younger as well. So in the another example quickly. Um, let's go to the International Council of Women in 1888. This is when women gather in the United States from the Western world. And it's the first time it's happened on United States soil. And thousands of women are here, and they're looking at the position of women around the world. It's an international feminist convention, if you will. And one of the speakers is a woman named Alice Fletcher. She's an early ethnographer, pre anthropology, and she is talking about Indian women, the term that was used then. And one of the stories she tells is that she's with a group of, these are Omaha women, the sort of Midwest Nebraska area today. Omaha Nation, and one of the women gives a horse to a friend. And Alice said, without thinking, I said to her, hadn't you better check with your husband? And she says, the merriment with which my statement was met. And it's, these Native women are like, why would you ask your husband? Just for a minute, she forgot she was not with white women. And she goes on to say that They're very aware of what's going to happen to them when they're forced into the laws of the United States. You know, this is the period of forced colonization. This is the period of children being taken away from their parents, native children, and sent to boarding schools from Omaha, from the Omaha Nation. They were sent all the way to Carlisle in Pennsylvania. Some of them never came back until they were 18 years old. They had no idea who they were by that time because the goal was to Christianize and civilize the Indians. And so she says these Indian women are really concerned about what's going to happen to them when they come under United States law. They know that it will set them back. And then she goes on to say, you know, the Indian man that I've talked to, and she cites, and I've traced it down, I think it's Sitting Bull, the Lakota spiritual leader. And Sitting Bull said, we're worried about what's going to happen to all of us when we come under US law. But we're especially worried about what's going to happen to the women because they're going to lose their rights as Indians and they're going to lose their rights as women. It'll be a double loss. So they're very aware of what this colonization experience, the damage that it is doing to them already and will do. I want to finally live with Matilda Jocelyn Gage. And if you don't know about her, please Google her. MatildaJocelynGage.org. Joslyn is the spelling of her middle name. That's her maiden name. The women kept their maiden names after they married. The suffragists did. So Matilda Jocelyn Gage is actually equally important with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. She ultimately gets written out of history. It's another whole story. But she, at the time, is when she's president, for example, of the National Woman Suffrage Association, the Stanton, Anthony, Matilda Jocelyn Gage sharing equal leadership positions. And 1 year she's president, 1 year Anthony is, typically Stanton is. But when Gage is president, she does a whole series of articles, front page articles for the New York Evening Post on the Haudenosaunee. And the editor introduces the first one saying, it is only appropriate that the leader of the suffrage movement is writing about the superior position of Native women. Gage writes about that extensively. Her book, Woman, Church, and State, which is it's available through the Matilda Jocelyn Gage Foundation website, but it's also online and searchable. First chapter is on the matriarchate, and she uses the Haudenosaunee. That is the example she gives of these women sacred, peaceful, egalitarian societies that predate Christianity. They're basically indigenous cultures that she's talking about generally. And she says about the Haudenosaunee, never was justice more perfect, never was civilization higher. And she talks about the women as the agriculturalists. You know, they basically controlled the economy because they had the distribution of food. Uh, she also talks about how they have final decision about the land, final decision about war and peace. All of that part of the tradition of the Haudenosaunee, the responsibilities of women. So she, in 1893, is arrested in her nation. She's arrested in Fayetteville, New York, um, for voting for a school commissioner. The women have, in 1880, gotten a law passed that gave them the vote in school board elections. That's local. She's now pushing the envelope and saying, I want to vote for school superintendent, which is a state position. She's, you know, attempting to see if they can push this legal authority they have to vote for for things related to schools. Well, she's arrested. She doesn't win the case. But the same year, she is given an honorary adoption into the Wolf Clan of the Mohawk Nation and given a real name. I apologize for my pronunciation, but uh, Hoanahawi, and it essentially translates out as "She who holds the sky." It's a very honorable name, and she writes to her daughter and says, my clan sisters said that they might consider me for a voice in the Council of Matrons, which would give her, of course, a political voice in her adopted native nation. Don't know if it happened. There's no record, but there's the consideration of that possibility. So, arrested in her own nation for voting the same year, she is considered for a political voice in her adopted native nation. So, I'm going to end there and put on my glasses so I can find your questions. This is new to me. I've been doing dozens and dozens of Zooms, but let me see what I can find in the chat. I hope I can find your questions. Not seeing questions. Um, well, I'm not having luck with this. Um, if anyone could help me with this to see where I might be able to find questions. You know that when we were working this out, um, I'm having trouble getting rid of this. Okay. Mhm. If anyone could, let's just see. I found them. Jace. Oh, wonderful to hear from you, Jace. Thank you. Was women's experience similar in other tribes? For example, the Munsee. This is a really important question, and let me give you the best that I can about this. Um, I think the answer to that is we don't know. We do know, of course, about the Cherokee, uh, the um, the five civilized tribes. Pretty the oh, let me think who else. The Navajo women having this same position, but I'm gonna here is a let the buyer beware. I think first of all, there is a whole lot of work that needs to be done to really answer this question, work that has not been done. Typically, it's been male anthropologists traditionally that have done the studies. And, if men are coming into a community and they're asking questions, they may not get the full answer. Um, if they're asking the men. The other thing is that they may get they may get fooled. I tell you a story that one of my friends, Virginia Driving Hawk Sneevy, told me. She's Lakota, uh, from Rosebud, in South Dakota. And she said that when she was a teenager, I'm going to tell this story as best as I remember her telling me. When she was a teenager, and a group of, I think they were from Harvard, there were some doctoral candidates that were wandering around the res, taking notes about anything they could find, I guess. I don't know what they were studying, but the young people decided to have a little fun. So they said, come here, we don't tell the elders, but we wanna show you this ancient ritual that we've never shown before to white people. So they took them up to the swimming hole and they made up on the spot this whole ancient Lakota courtship ritual. And these these anthropologists were like, you know, writing like crazy. First ones to have access to this information. I don't know whether they ever, got a doctorate for writing about an ancient Lakota mating ritual, but I think that playing around with people that come in and, inappropriately try to extract information, it may not be just that single story. But the other thing is, we're learning more as Native women are writing about who they are and about what their history is. And Native scholars are changing the discipline. And also, there are non Native scholars that are looking at the information through different eyes, not through the eyes of white exceptionalism, not looking through it uh, the eyes of racism, really working to understand better, but especially the women telling their own stories. And I think if we look at what happened with during the time of the Dakota Pipeline, the Lakota and Dakota women were, white people called them the Sioux, but the Lakota and Dakota women really began to say, we are the keepers of culture. We have a position that is very different than the anthropologists. They didn't say it in these terms, but what they were describing was really different than what the anthropologists have said. There's a patriarchal culture, the Sioux, the fighting Sioux. I was driving through Pine Ridge Reservation with a friend of mine, and she was kind of pointing out, well, so and so lives here and so lives there. And then she said, oh, there's that guy that the his aunties just put him up as chief. And I said, Karen, don't lie to me. You know that you're a patriarchal, you know, male rule political system. Don't tell me that you, the women, put the chiefs up, in their position, which is, of course, the same thing as the Haudenosaunee. The balance, and the Haudenosaunee women consistently don't describe it as having power over, but having dual responsibilities, and the goal is to keep it in balance and harmony. So that's the best I can answer that question. And now that I've discovered the questions, I will see if there's any more. I think that's it. I'll share one more story with you. And if that results in any more questions or comments, please. Um, I lectured one time at the Elizabeth Cady Stanton annual birthday tea with one of the clan mothers from Onondaga. And I remember using that Elizabeth Cady Stanton quote about cut off his horns. And the it was really funny because, of course, the feminist audience just went wild. Cut off his horns. Boy, that's a powerful statement. And I said the clan mother has the right to cut off his horns, using the Stanton quote. Audrey, the clown mother, got up and just talked about her responsibilities as the clown mother. And she said, I have the responsibility to remove him if he doesn't listen to the will of the people. And I've never done it. It would be the saddest thing I would ever see because it would mean that we were so out of balance. And afterwards, when Audrey and I were talking about, I said, I always talk about rights, and you talk about responsibilities. What's the difference here? And what we came up with was that rights are what we talk about in their absence. Responsibilities are what you have when you have created balance and equality. Um, One of the questions that typically, um, feminists will ask is, well, can a woman be the chief? And I've come to understand the inappropriateness. It was one of my early questions too. But I've come to understand the inappropriateness of it. In an elected system, a woman can be a chief. And of course, Wilma Mankiller was the first elected woman chief of the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma. And that that functions in those native nations that have chosen dual citizenship, where they are citizens of their own nations, and they vote in their own nations, and they have their own national system, often through the process of assimilation, having developed a system that is similar to the United States elected system. They also, while maintaining um, the um, the citizenship in their own nations, their native nations, they also have, many of them, accepted citizenship in the United States as it was forced on them and given to them, depending on your perspective, in 1924. Of course, Native women didn't, or men, vote in United States elections until then. Some of them still don't. The traditional Haudenosaunee have maintained their absolute sovereignty, and they are only citizens of their own individual nations. But the dual citizenship that others have accepted, um, it can result in, the victories, like the number of Native women that were elected to Congress in this last election, and the one before that, the first two, and then now I think there's more. So, I think the logic that I've heard in explaining why we accept dual citizenship, some of the nations, is that. They say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so having a voice in this political system that has such an impact on their lives, they see as important. So, can you direct us to information about how enslaved persons were treated if they joined a clan family? That's really interesting, and I think that question is still being explored, as far as I know. Um, there is a tradition that I've heard, especially the oldest clan mother at Onondaga told me that there was a tradition um, of native nations here in the north uh, welcoming in enslaved people if they were taking sanctuary. The Cherokee, Eastern Cherokee, before removal, owned slaves. How much of that was following the U.S. process, and how much of that was, if you owned them, they couldn't be returned to other owners? So I don't know how much it was protection and how much it was actual um, following enslavement. Other tradition that as an outsider again has been really interesting to me is the stories that I've heard at different nations and just talking to folks, them talk about white families bringing a child that they couldn't afford to raise to a native community, and knowing that that child would be raised in that native community. The other thing is I was just talking to a friend at Onondaga, and she was saying that this was the first year in which there weren't an influx of white kids coming to trick and treat on the Onondaga Nation, because their parents apparently know that they'll get candy and that they'll be safe if they come there. But because of COVID, that didn't happen this year. Number of Native people talk to about the number of animals, especially dogs, that get dropped off on their nations. So it's the sense of welcome, the sense of making relatives, that tradition um, seems to be pretty widespread. I know the Lakota have the tradition of making relatives. The Haudenosaunee have a tradition of replacing people that are lost, are gone, are killed or die, with someone to hold that position, that relationship of son or daughter. Or so I'm an outsider. That's the best I can give you. To see if there's any more questions. Not. I'm so glad I found where these are. I think my computer is opposite of the folks that were helping me, because the places where I was to look for things were not where they were. But no, I'm an old hat at this, old hand at this. I can do this. I will wait a minute to see if there's any more questions or comments. I want to just say this, that this knowledge is not something that I looked for. This information is not something that I ever thought was a possibility. I was just really trying to find out, and I got a National Endowment for the Humanities fellowship, to a scholarship, to study how did Matilda Jocelyn Gage get such a vision of transformation of society. She really basically is calling for an end to patriarchy. She's calling for an end to any oppressive systems of power over. And my question as a feminist uh, and scholar was, well, how did she know that was even possible? When you're in that oppressed condition that I was talking about, where you don't even have personhood, equality is what you're going to be going for. That's what you're going to want. That's what you're going to see. That's what was heavily in the movement, in the women's movement in the 19th century. We just need personhood, for heaven's sakes. And so, how did she get a sense of something more? And that's when, in Woman, Church, and State, when she says, never was justice more perfect, never was civilization higher, that was, that should have been a clue to me right away, right? Well, if we're to do full disclosure, I didn't see it. And when I finally saw it and thought, probably 15 years after I had first read that, I did introduction after introduction to editions of reprints of Woman, Church, and State, knew the book better than anybody ever in this lifetime, anyway, in this time period, and never saw that. It's there. It's there in the first chapter, in the first few pages. And why didn't I see it? And that was realizing that my racism um, was poisoning my scholarship, that I had deep assumption that I was not even conscious of, that Indian women were just really beasts of burden. They walked 10 paces behind their husbands. They they were ciphers. They were non-entities. And so that was really a telling moment for me in my life. What I realized was that I, as a white scholar, was most likely to get it wrong and to do damage, that that was my default mode. And when I read a lot of the secondary sources, the white scholars, it reinforced that fear, that that is probably what I was going to do. Because as I was reading the original sources and learning from the Haudenosaunee themselves, it was a whole different world than what I was being introduced to by the Iroquois scholars, the Iroquoianists call themselves. Mostly white, mostly men, all white, mostly men. Um, so I took it very slowly, and I actually went back through 300 years of contact narratives and every primary source, Native people that I could find. Spent lots of time in the Smithsonian, the Library of Congress, collections around the country, and really seeing whether this was real because nobody had written about this before. But there was one thing that kept me, it was like a light that I could follow. And it was Paula Gunn Allen, who is a Native scholar. And I want to read you in her pioneering work, The Sacred Hoop, Recovering the Feminine in American Indian Traditions, a book I would still highly recommend. It came out in 1986. Sometimes I get confused which century I'm in. Um, Paula Gunn Allen writes, an odd thing occurs in the minds of Americans when Indian civilization is mentioned, little or nothing. As I write this, I am aware of how far removed my version of the roots of American feminism must seem to those steeped in either mainstream or radical versions of feminism's history. I am keenly aware of the lack of image Americans have about our continent's recent past. I am intensely conscious of popular notions of Indian women as beasts of burden, squaws, traitors, or at best, vanished denizens of a long lost wilderness. How odd, then, must my contention seem that the gynocratic tribes of the American continent provided the basis for all the dreams of liberation that characterize the modern world. The vision that impels feminists to action was the vision of the Grandmothers Society. And that's what's kept me centered and doing this work and trying to do it as respectfully as I can, uh, to appreciate but not appropriate. And that's a hard line for white scholars to follow. I think I find it difficult anyway. Um, so I said that I would, at the end, come back to this beautiful, frightening day that I'm experiencing. And if you're in New York State, my guess is you may be experiencing it as well. 71-degree weather on November 8th. This is not normal. And when I look at how are we going to save life on this planet, we have very little time. And when I say life, I'm not talking about human life alone. We are all related. Indigenous people know that. They live it. And when the bees go, we're gone. We can't survive without the bees. We are all related. The Thanksgiving of the Haudenosaunee, the Takayasin, we are all related of the Lakota. It's the truth of science. Now, when I look at my Haudenosaunee sisters having political voice for 1,000 years, I think, who do I look to for leadership? You know, these are people who have 1,000 year tradition of democracy. I think we can learn a thing or two about them as we reinvent them. We reinvent democracy in this moment starting today. And I also think that while we're struggling to find a way within our patriarchal culture of creating an end to climate catastrophe, that we might want to just ask the people who have a a track record that was really extraordinary of not pristine, don't touch it, but work with the other living entities to strengthen them. Um, yeah, we're learning that now with forest fires. We're starting finally to ask indigenous people, what'd you do? Well, controlled burning. You know, Smokey the Bear had it wrong and lied to us for years and years. Only you can prevent forest fires. We need to create forest fires in a small way so that they don't grow into those giant catastrophes. We need to learn from Native people. Is I think my final statement to you. I'm going to check and see if there's any more comments and or questions, and if not, I will I will thank you for this opportunity to chat with you, and I want to thank the humanities for the New York Humanities for making this event possible, and my friends from Clermont to uh, to ask me to make this presentation. Thank you, and have a wonderful rest of the day.